Welcome to the audiobook version of Toyon, Multilingual Literary Magazine, Volume 67, Lados. Special thanks to Kirk and Yuan for their translations, and to the HSU Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for their generous support of the Volume 67 Multilingual Translation Project. Toyon Literary Magazine accepts submissions year-round. All artists are invited to submit. For more information, please see our website at www.toyonliterarymagazine.org.
Dear reader, welcome to the 67th volume of Toyon Literary Magazine. The concept for this volume developed over years, with planning and discussions happening before we had released our last volume. Originally, we had plans to create a joint issue of Toyon with the magazine Blanco y Negra from La Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez de Oaxaca. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, earthquakes, wildfires, and the passing of their faculty advisor Guadalupe Angela last spring, we lost contact with our partners. We hope that in the future, the two publications can reconnect and collaborate once again. While we have had to adjust our methods and execution for this project, the heart of our intentions and goals for 67 has remained the same. De dos lados is a reference to existing within multiple spaces, physically, emotionally, mentally, or otherwise. Distance learning, working, and socializing has made this kind of versatility all the more prevalent in our daily lives. In this edition, we aspire to highlight multilingual writing and hold space for the complex experiences of marginalized peoples and the resilience, creativity, and joy that can emerge from these moments. Although we give special consideration to pieces that align with our theme, Toyon is open to anyone who wants to contribute and any topics, so long as they do not promote hate speech or any oppressive systems. We received submissions that were moving, intimate, and powerful. Writing can be a vulnerable experience. We appreciate all of the people who trust us with their works and cherish the opportunity to review them. As a student-led journal, our space is always limited, but our goals for each volume evolve along with our staff. Please remember, there is always room to revise and resubmit. While Toyon always accepts multilingual works, this year we made additional efforts to encourage multilingual submissions, as duality is an inherent aspect of translating and bilingualism. Grant funding from the HSU Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion allowed us to bring on 2 multilingual writers to translate selected works into Spanish, Chinese, and English. Both writers have been a part of the Toyon community prior to this project. Kirk, who did the Spanish and English translations, is an HSU alumni and has original works published in Volume 62. Yuan Changming did the Chinese translations and was published in Volume 66 as well as this volume. The authors and the students from our translation team met with our translation writers through Zoom to share insights on our processes and inspirations. We're so grateful for this experience and the connections we could make along the way. Toyon is always a team effort. This year, the world and our staff had to grapple with unprecedented challenges, and despite everything, 67 came together beautifully. I want to thank all of our contributors for creating and sharing their art during this time, all of our supporters for boosting our call for submissions and funding this project, our predecessors who pushed this publication towards social and environmental justice and held us accountable for acting in accordance with our values, the staff of 67 for their flexibility and patience during this process of making this book, our faculty advisor for guiding us through it all while encouraging our creative freedom, and thank you for opening this book and engaging with our content. We hope you enjoy it. Sincerely, Theressa Lopez, Managing Editor, Toyon 67.
Cock Robin Island by Angie Young-Petrillo. Read by the author.
If you've never been to a delta, I have no hope of describing it to you. The delta is something you must feel with your skin, carry it back with you, and wonder how many showers it will take to wash off. The more often you go, the deeper it seeps, and suddenly you have delta in your bones. Like DDT, it'll never leave you. It'll come out to play with your organs, and you'll curse it the same. You'll only ever find comfort in the recognition of transience, and the melancholic sensibility you possess must be fed, body and spirit. No, if you've never been to a delta, you won't understand. But try. The smoke cleared enough to see robin's egg skies, and that meant it was time for a drive. My old best friend's mom has a goal to drive every road in California. Lofty, sure, but my own father had shown it near possible. The attitude was, I've spent my whole life trying to get lost, and I haven't succeeded yet. He wasn't much of a hiker. But the last time I'd wandered proper through the back roads of Lolita was with my old best friend's mom nearly a decade ago, and we didn't do a thorough enough job. Humboldt's wonder rested in its ability to produce new roads lined with 100-year-old barns and historic plaques out of thin air. There's always something to marvel at, and rarely are there tourists marveling next to you, breathing their noisy tourist air. I took off towards Table Bluff Reservation and meandered through the tall grass and coast cypress. The road had fewer potholes than you'd expect, and the homes had that Pacific wash. A fence adorned with notes made of buoys and grids of abalone set the tune of nostalgia. That's the thing about the California coast. It's all one song. I came upon a resto amended speed sign. Hadn't seen an 80-mile-an-hour sign since the last time I was in Montana. Stuck to 25, good and slow, slowing further to peep into the homes I passed. I wondered if Hitchcock had considered this place for the birds, or if anyone had considered it for a remake. Trailers returning to Earth live next to Victorians so well preserved they'd be ID'd if they tried to buy liquor. Big swayed-back dairy barns so sweet you want to cry rest across from teensy houses absolutely festered with an infestation of dahlias. It's hard to pass through, not stop and set up shop, build a little lean-to and whittle the days away in the fields of Eden. People don't take kindly to that, though. I reached a crossroads and had a decision to make. There's a road, inconspicuous, that leads straight towards the ocean, its efforts thwarted by the jetty. It is perfect. Halfway down it, I almost hit a baby goat, your reason to drive slowly, that took it upon itself to do a disturbing display of adorableness. It jumped and reared to one side of the road where its siblings were munching the greenery, and absolutely skipped back across, soared into a perfect jump through the wired fence, and returned delicately back to mother. I'm about ready to trade my shithead dog for that baby goat, but I know the damn goat will grow into a shithead too. My map showed a bridge, single-laned, over the river to an island I'd never heard of before. As I pulled up to the lot before the bridge, an electric tingling rolled up my toes, threw my ankles up until it poured through my eyes and nose and made me shiver. A river delta. Right here. Like I just took the lid off my present. Anticipation creeped with me as I crawled over the bridge. The water of the eel was choppy, but a vivacious blue, and the river was wide and met silted beaches. Cockrobin Island is thick with trees, whose orange leaves littered the gravel road like confetti. A shot-to-shit road sign resided across from a gate that had a smattering of refuse in front of it. There are no trespassing signs, and I did not let my honed trepidation for going solo down middle-of-nowhere roads in Humboldt stop me. Cockrobin Island resides within a dream of a place and time that I did not think one could enter any longer on the coast of California. The more that I did think about it, the less I am sure that I did not cross into a separate dimension, for it felt as so. Heat rose, the air stilled, and it felt like an embrace. As I snuck down the lane, the trees parted here to reveal a field with a neat row of haystacks. There, to look out back towards the hills, over golden waves with green trim. A barn joined me on the left, and held on until I abruptly entered what I swear was the set of some Swedish film I watched a couple of years back. Bucolic, idyllic. These words do weak work to describe the home at the end of the lane. It's a vision. I was so stunned to behold it, I was rendered incapable of describing it. It was like beholding God, or so I've been told. I'll have to go back for a picture for you. I'll have to go back for myself. Riding back down that lane, crossing back over that bridge, as the spell lifted mile by mile, I felt I must humbly ask them if I could pitch a tent near the riverbank, bring what I may by boat, and take a proper rest from the wilds of society. You see, I grew up by a delta, and a delta's grown in me. I've got no speed until the stormy season, and when that hits, I'll wreck all in sight. Vital news is brought upon the backs of cranes, and the islands that can only be reached by water are always where I've known the treasures to be hidden. If you fall asleep upon the delta, the spirits will whisper secrets into your dreams, and when you wake, the look in your eyes will shake loose the guilt of man. All that is abandoned is beautiful in decay, and all will be washed into nothingness in due time. Fecundity is of the moment. Thus is the philosophy of the Delta. But you won't get it if you've never been to the Delta. You should fix that.
Cielo, Rosado by Jesús Martínez Saucedo. Read by the author.
Este poema es dedicado a Antonieta. Comienza el poema con un epígrafe de capitalismo gore de Sayak Valencia. Cito: la palabra welcome significando simultáneamente que toda entrada es una salida. El silencio que apuñala. Fin de la cita. En primer grado, coloreé el cielo de color rosado. Rosado como toronja rubí roja. El sol era de un anaranjado luminoso, y las nubes eran del color de lavanda dulce. Mis compañeros me ridiculizaron. No comprendía sus burlas o sus palabras. En ese entonces hablaba cero inglés, pero sabía que su burla era malintencionada. Obsidiana negra perforadora. Mi maestra no hizo caso de aquello. Recogió el dibujo entre sus manos y dijo: «Es maravilloso. ¿Cuál es el significado del color rosado?» Lloriqueando, tartamudeé que era el color del nuevo comienzo, un cielo nuevo que mi madre había prometido el día que dejamos México.
Pink Sky by Jesús Martínez Saucedo. Read by the author.
This poem is dedicated to Antonieta. I begin the poem with an epigraph from Sayak Valencia's Gore Capitalism. Quote, "The word welcome, meaning that every entrance is simultaneously an exit. Silence stabs," end quote. In first grade, I colored the sky pink like ruby red grapefruit. The sun was a bright orange, and the clouds were the color of sweet lavender. My classmates ridiculed me. I didn't understand their laughter or their words. I spoke zero English back then, but I knew their laughter was malintent, piercing black obsidian. My teacher brushed it off, picked up the drawing in her hands, and said, "Es maravilloso. ¿Cuál es el significado del color rosado?" Sobbing, I stammered that it was the color of the new beginning, un cielo nuevo, that my mother had promised the day we left Mexico.
Promises by Amita, Basu. Read by Connie Pearson. Suman. Why are you standing here, Ma? Suman stepped onto the balcony. You know this polluted air aggravates your asthma. Come inside. Suman gasped. 120 miles away, through the sky suddenly clear, the blue-white Himalayas gleamed wide. Moist-eyed, Grandma turned. It's been 30 years since I've seen the Himalayas here. Arnab. Non-essential shipments suspended. The Nike t-shirt Arnab ordered hadn't been shipped. Neither had Rumi's D&G aviators. Slaving all day, Arnab and Rumi had fallen into ordering something every evening. Something to look forward to. Home now, across their office desk, Arnab glanced up at Rumi. A smile hesitated at Rumi's lips. Tricia. After hours queuing, Tricia entered the supermarket. Vegetable shelves, empty. Everything was being rationed. Still. Production curtailed, transport disrupted, supplies were simply insufficient. Swallowing tears, Tricia bought potatoes again. Fumbling for keys, Tricia glanced at her garden. Half-withered tomato saplings, shriveled pumpkin creepers. Commenced with fresh enthusiasm, gardening too had succumbed to old laziness. Suman. I'm bored, Ma, cried Girish. Danush is playing outside. Suman hesitated, glancing outside. Danush doesn't have asthma. Let him go, said Grandma. The air's clean now. He'll be fine. Girish ran off. Grandma approached the air purifier. Let's turn this off now, daughter. This burns electricity, dirties other people's air. Arnab. Arnab and Rumi had been in love 10 years ago. Slaving all week, offices worlds apart, collaborating, flirting, commiserating with colleagues. Weekends consumed by binge watching, binge shopping, binge drinking. Arnab brought the chamomile tea to Rumi at the window seat. She'd had chamomile tea every evening for 7 years. He had just learned this. Tricia. Tricia uprooted the weeds. White flowers, parthenium. Finally, she'd learned the name of this weed she'd always seen. A bird landed near her. Mina? No, cuckoo. How could she mistake it? She'd been a birder. A lifetime ago, she'd seen cuckoos here in Bangalore. Sun-yellow tomato flowers nodded in the breeze. Suman. The lockdown lifted. The government had promised more buses, more bus routes, so that the cars that had left the streets could stay off, so that Grandma could keep watching the Himalayas from the balcony in Jalandhar. No. Simran bought another air purifier. She changed out Grandma's anti-pollution mask and Girish's every week now. Arnab. The lockdown lifted. Arnab and Rumi had promised dinner together, weekends together. They'd bought this house together. Now they'd discussed a baby. They'd stopped ordering shiny things online. Arnab had started missing Rumi when she nipped from their office desk to the bathroom. No. Working, shopping, the twin sirens reclaimed them. Tricia. The lockdown lifted. Tricia promised she'd keep gardening, feeding the bee-eaters, time-traveling to her, iridescent green in the sunlight. She'd develop at least vegetable self-sufficiency against the next emergency, courtesy irresponsible world leaders. She'd start voting, buy only organic. No. Blood-red tomatoes withered on the vine. Parthenium reclaimed everything. Promises. Between Grandma and the Himalayas, gray-brown skies fell again. Herded back indoors, Girish demanded an Xbox. In her Audi, Suman grew reaccustomed to zero visibility. Again, lovers became strangers. We moved out, sold our houses, married our colleagues. Cuckoos and bee-eaters disappeared. For good this time. We made promises, but old habits reclaimed us. Tortillas by Theressa Lopez. Read by the author.
16. Because mine won't be pretty. She gives the same answer as before. They always come out in funny shapes and I can't get them round enough, my mother said as she set down the bag. She rips along the plastic's perforated edge and pulls out a stack of frozen tortillas. The back burner glows red, and she dials it back. Waits for the comal to return to warmth. Peels the first flat gray circle from the stack and sets it on the stove. It bubbles, like the ones Nana made. 3 to 10. Nana made them from scratch. Flour, water, salt, and lard. She removed her rings and mixed it by hand. When she kneaded the dough enough, she pulled out the wooden cutting board and coated it with a thin layer of flour. From the big glob of masa, she collected little masa balls and pressed them into the board. She used an inherited piece of old pipe as a rolling pin, but she didn't call it that. I don't remember her word for it anymore. I miss hearing it hit the wooden board. Roll, roll, roll. She stopped to flip the masa. Roll, roll, roll. Flip, and again until it's a flat, perfect circle. She placed this circle on the warm comal. It bubbled. Flip. The circle was white with brown spots. It bubbled and lifted. She picked it up with her hands and set it to the side. I reached for it. She tapped my hand away and then placed a glob of masa in my palm. It was Play-Doh in my hands. If you give away the first tortilla, you have to make them forever. 12 to 15. My mom flips a tortilla with a butter knife. It is white with brown spots. It bubbles and lifts. She picks it up with a knife and sets it aside. 17. I use the packaged tortillas, like my mom. I set one on our comal. It bubbles, lifts. I flip it with my hand and set it to the side. My sister reaches, and I tap her hand away. It's too hot. I know now, we don't eat the first tortilla. In my mind, I eat the first one Nana made. 20. My mom makes everyone's favorite foods for Christmas. This year, I asked for homemade tortillas again. They're a lot of work. You better help me so we can make the other foods too. We made this agreement the past 2 Christmases before I ended up picking different dishes. This year, I won't change my mind. I'm in charge of the shopping list. I ask about the rolling pin. Do we still have it? Rolling pin? Come on, don't act like you don't know what it's called. I wait silently for memories of sentences Nana spoke. You remember the palote? The word wraps around me like one of Nana's old sweaters and paints more details into my memories. With a single word, my soul is a step closer to hers.
Tortillas by Theressa Lopez. Read by Kirk Lua.
Because mine won't be pretty. Ella da la misma respuesta que antes. They always come out in funny shapes. I can't get them round enough, dijo mi mamá mientras dejaba la bolsa. Rasca el borde perforado del plástico y saca una pila de tortillas congeladas. El quemador trasero se brilla rojo y ella lo pone para atrás. Espera que el comal vuelva a calentarse. Jala el primer círculo gris plano de la pila y lo pone en la estufa. It bubbles like the ones Nana made. 3 through 10. Nana los hizo desde cero. Harina, agua y sal. Se quitó los anillos y lo mezcló a mano. Cuando amasó la masa lo suficiente, ella sacó la tabla de cortar de madera y lo cubrió con una capa fina de harina. De la bola grande de masa, ella recibió bolitas de masa y los presionó en la tabla. Usó un pedazo de una pipa vieja que heredó como rodillo de amasar, pero no lo llamó así. Ya no recuerdo cómo lo llamaba. Extraño escucharlo golpear la tabla. Roll, roll, roll. Ella paró para voltear la masa. Roll, roll, roll. Flip. Y una y otra vez hasta que sea un círculo plano y perfecto. Ella puso este círculo en el comal caliente y burbujeó. Flip. El círculo era blanco con manchas cafés. Se burbujeaba y se levantaba. Lo tomó con las manos y lo dejó a un lado. Lo alcancé. Ella me dio un golpecito a mi mano y luego puso una bola de masa en mi palma. Era plastilina en mis manos. Si regalas la primera tortilla, tienes que hacerlas por siempre. 12 through 15. My mom flips the tortilla with a butter knife. It is white with brown spots. It bubbles and lifts. She picks it up with the knife and sets it aside. 17. Yo uso las tortillas empaquetadas como mi mamá. Pongo una en nuestro comal. Burbuja, se levanta. Lo vuelto con la mano y lo dejo a un lado. Mi hermana la alcanza, le doy un golpecito a su mano. It's too hot. Ya lo sé. No comemos la primera tortilla. En mi mente me comí la primera que hizo mi nana. 20. Mi mamá prepara las comidas favoritas de todos para Navidad. Este año vuelvo a pedir tortillas hechas a mano. They're a lot of work. You better help me so we can make the other foods too. Hicimos este acuerdo las dos últimas Navidades antes de que terminara escogiendo platos diferentes. Este año no cambiaré de opinión. Estoy a cargo de la lista de compras. Le pregunto por el rodillo. Todavía lo tenemos. Rolling pin? Come on, don't act like you don't know what it's called. Espero en silencio por los recuerdos de las frases que dijo Nana. You remember? The palote. La palabra me envuelve como uno de los viejos suéteres de Nana y pinta más detalles en mis recuerdos. Con una sola palabra, mi alma está a un paso más acerca a la de ella.
Corn by Yuan Changming. Read by the author.
Corn, a whole body of teeth, nothing but teeth. To chew the passing summer, we bite off from you all the pearl-like memories tinged with sunlight. A hard but juicy kiss. 玉米，全身上下都是牙齿，别无其他。咀嚼着正在逝去的夏天，我们从你身上咬下所有珍珠般的记忆，沾满了阳光，一阵坚硬而甜蜜的吻。
Maíz by Yuan Changming. read by Kirk Lua.
Un cuerpo entero de dientes, nada más que dientes, para masticar el verano transitorio. Mordemos de ti todos los recuerdos perlados, teñido con la luz del sol. Un beso firme, pero meloso.
Everything is Kindling, Everything Burns by T.William Wallin-Sato. Read by the author.
Everything is kindling, everything burns. The house burns like the cherry embers of a forgotten cigarette. The forgotten cigarette burns like the larynx of an opera singer. The opera singer burns like the jazz hands of Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk burns like a star only visible away from neon. The neon burns like a cityscape skyline scorned with Seagram's highball. The Seagram's highball burns like a dive bar poet enraptured in his craft. A dive bar poet burns like the high country bear's first salmon kill of the season. The first kill burns like the first kiss of a long-awaited funeral. The kiss burns like the runaway atop the Midnight Express. The runaway burns like the summer solstice sunset below the Ozarks. The sunset burns like early morning fog crisscrossing Elk Meadows. The fog burns like a riot encapsulating gated communities. A riot burns like a 6-inch knife sliding back only 4. A knife burns like the death row inmate meditating on his impermanence.
The Beats by Kirby Wright. Read by Connie Pearson. Creatives roam the trumpet and drum streets flanking Columbia. This marching salon reveres the spontaneous and bleeds in the now. Boots move to crush raping editors. First thought, best thought, Ginsberg calls. They dare wordsmiths fattened by doughy routine to challenge big publishing houses. Burroughs frees quaaludes from a bottle. The rebels shoot sperm on the doors of censors. They savage a path from Broadway to Central Park, devouring drugs that mix or don't mix well. They dangle stale verse from ropes of human hair. They bound rivers of vomit. Kerouac tap dances on sidewalk gum. They drag land, ocean, and sky into thousands of dreams. Their skeleton key releases passion and lust. Look to the sky and listen. Fresh voices rattle the heavens, beating it open with song. Moisés y el Malverde by Jibril Stevenson. Read by Ernie Enriquez.
Moisés had been walking for 40 days when he had met Jesús Malverde. He and Josué had left Tegucigalpa before dawn. They didn't want to leave, but Moisés had killed one of los faraones when the gang was shaking down Josué's bodega. It would surely be ruled self-defense in court, but he and Josué knew that they would both be on a hit list for sure. Moisés had a brother in San Antonio, so they beat feet for El Norte. By the time they emerged from the jungles of the south into the valleys of central Mexico, they had run through all their savings and were living off what they could hunt, gather, or steal. Fishing from the banks of the filthy Lerma, with a hook and line he had found in the trash, Josué caught something big, a giant catfish from what he could make out through the murky water. He and Moisés fought the fish valiantly until it finally slipped away hours later and many miles downstream. They realized it had dragged them so far along the riverbank that they were out of the city and up to their knees in the salty muck that was all that remained of the ancient Lago Texcoco, whence the Aztecs had once ruled half the continent. He was there, waiting for Moisés. They didn't know he was in Malverde at the time, of course. though they had seen his image on Mexican novelas. He was just another paisa in cowboy dress, looking more narco than santo. Still, Moisés knew this was a sacred place, and such a meeting could not be a coincidence. So he slapped Josué in the back of the head, and they both removed their hats out of respect. "You headed north, muchachos?" asked the paisa without introducing himself. "Yes," said Moisés. "You know the way?" He nodded and stroked his mustaches in contemplation. "Yeah, I know it, but I don't think you'll be able to make it the whole way with me." "We've made it this far, no? Okay, then. But if you bother me with questions, you'll stay wherever you are." Moisés wasn't worried. He was used to not asking questions, and wherever the man decided to leave him, he'd be no worse off than now. He waved to Josué, and they followed El Malverde to a Chevrolet Silverado, 4x4 he had parked on a patch of dry ground at the edge of the swamp. Josué looked at Moisés with questioning eyes, but Moisés just shook his head. They drove day and night until they reached Guadalajara. El Malverde parked the Chevy in a vacant lot where hundreds of people were sleeping in the open, some in the ruins of an abandoned factory, and others in the sliver of shade cast by a parked 18-wheeler. Men, women, and children, guanacos, chapines, and catarchos, they lay exhausted among the meager possessions they had managed to bring from their homelands. Looking over his shoulders, El Malverde approached the truck and placed a small package under the cab. Then, he hopped back into the Chevy and took off. As the pickup pulled away from the lot, Moisés heard a loud explosion. The rearview mirror showed him the crimson flames leaping from the wreckage of the 18-wheeler. "But why?" he asked before he realized his mistake. "No more questions," said El Malverde, "or you'll be left on foot." "Sorry, caballero. It won't happen again." And so they continued their way, Moisés, Josué, and Jesús Malverde, until they reached Culiacán. El Malverde parked the Chevy outside a humble cinder block house in a humble cinder block neighborhood. "Stay here," he said, and went into the house. Moisés and Josué heard a ruckus, and then they saw a young man sprint out the front door. Cool as a cucumber, El Malverde strode out the door behind him, raised his revolver, and fired 3 shots. The young man fell to the ground in a pool of blood. El Malverde got into the truck and turned on the radio. A sad bolero was playing. "Let's go." As they pulled away from the house and the voice of a woman crying inside, Moisés couldn't help asking, "So you're a sicario then?" "I won't warn you again. One more question and you'll have to walk to the gabacho." They drove day and night again, El Malverde showing no signs of tiring until they reached Nogales. There, they saw the wall, the infamous wall, a barrier of steel and concrete stretching 10 meters into the sky, and to hear it told, 3 meters underground. "I've seen bigger," said El Malverde. They were at a spot far from the road at the official point of entry, halfway in between 2 guard towers where Border Patrol officers in forest green uniforms manned heavy machine guns. Floodlights swept the desert in all directions, but this one spot, a cluster of rocky outcroppings, afforded them a concealment from searching eyes. At the base of the wall, a group of would-be immigrants was tearing at the wall with pickaxes and had nearly opened a hole through the thinnest section. El Malverde fired a shot in the air, and the immigrants scattered. "Come on," he said, and took some tools from the bed of the Chevy. Too frightened not to comply, Moisés and Josué followed his lead, and together they repaired the hole in the wall. "That gringo said the Mexicans would build the wall," said Moisés when they had finished their strange endeavor. "But I never thought I'd help." "Strike 3, said El Malverde. "This is where we say adios." "Okay," said Moisés, not entirely unhappy to be parting ways with this possible psychopath. "But tell me, who are you? You're not just any sicario. Why did you do what you did?" "I told you, you'd never make it with me. The owner of the trailer was the worst coyote in Mexico. He was going to sell those people as slaves in Gringolandia." Moisés nodded. He had heard that such things happen. "That kid I killed was already one of the deadliest sicarios in Mexico, murderer of 100 innocents. But his mother is a saint. Still young enough, God will bless her with another son, who will grow up to be the first Mexican pope. Now Moisés let his jaw hang open. Who would have imagined? And the wall? He asked. 10 meters underground, there's a tunnel so deep and wide that 100 can pass through at once. If La Mira had seen that hole in the wall, they would have found the tunnel, and thousands of immigrants would have never reached the other side. How could Moisés have been so stupid? Of course, a man this wise would have not have fixed up the wall for no reason. And if there was a tunnel underneath, right here, outside Nogales? No, said Jesús Malverde, for Moisés was now sure it was him. You are to take a different path. Take this walking stick, because from here on out, you're on foot. Moisés took the walking stick, realizing he had missed having one during his trek through the southern forests. He turned to Josué. You go through the tunnel. I'll see you in San Antonio. Josué nodded and scurried off, probably afraid the border patrol would soon be upon them. Moisés turned to say goodbye to El Malverde, but he was gone, without leaving so much as a footprint in the sand. The Chevy was gone too. Moisés was utterly alone in the desert, and he knew just what to do. A month later, Moisés stood on the beach on the northmost tip of Yucatan, looking northward across the Gulf towards the still visible coasts of Florida. Behind him stood 7,000 men, women, and children, guanacos, chapines, and catarchos, in their meager possessions, crammed into suitcases, knapsacks, and garbage bags. They all waited for a signal. Moisés held out his walking stick and touched the surf.
Latin Mass by Claire Shu Akamondo. Read by the author.
Standing in line at Starbucks on Ringzheng Road, Beijing. Years ago, on a Sunday morning, I would have been in church, kneeling, comforted by the Latin Mass. In Istanbul, Nairobi, Paris, or Kabul, with no knowledge of the language, the heavy door pushed open, I was home. Votive flames in crimson glasses. Dominus vobiscum, voices sang back. E cum spiritu tuo. Now priests speak Turkish, Swahili, French, or Pashto. No credo, no Agnus Dei, to let me know things are in order in my heart, my head, the whole mundi. In line at Starbucks, I turn to order. I point to a number. The Chinese woman in forest green asks, "Café? Latte? Grande?" Amen, I say. Amen.
My Body, My Mind by T.R. Reece. Read by Yuan Changming.
我的身体，我的心。有大窗的房子易冷，有小窗的房子又阳光不足。我常告诉别人，也私下思量，我太透明了，他们是否也这样想？不管怎样，一个人需要多久才会识其心智？我边想边刮肚收藏，在地板上播撒着文稿、记忆、经历和对话，试图从中找到答案，并拿捏住此时对我的含义。我到底是谁？我是个坏人吗？我知道好与坏是愚蠢的二分法。我发誓对别人并非如此不可原谅。失去心智的麻烦在于，你不能次次都肯定它是否被人偷走了。早晨醒来，我知道鸟儿已经南飞，带走了所有的心与灵，还有我的屋顶，我的瓦当然是今天的牺牲处。潮湿、 沁入你的头，让你发疯，你是知道的。我发誓，我往日并不疯。说真的，我仍然不认为我疯了。如果我当下写得十分诚实，这只是有时我觉得我参差不齐的牙齿、乳房和鼻子，尚可为扭曲的内心发挥某种外在的功能。其实，我想大多物事都扭曲如斯，因为饱经磨损，我觉得好人都已坏透，其屋顶和希望都太高。不明白人的躯体会到期，事情也并非总能顺随人意。我将用彩绘玻璃换掉我的窗子，把我的躯体唱成赞歌，并非事事都会越变越好，并非事事都会变得越好，直到它们果真变好。
Brada by Short Latina, read by the author.
Faye knew exactly how to pack a good suitcase. She had not been anywhere but here and never there, but she was always thinking about running away. She had this odd feeling, a peculiar feeling, that she was not in the right world, dimension, or time. Everyone called her rara. She didn't exactly feel rara, but rather special, even magic. Ever since her arrival, her body seemed to repel living on this earth. Her spine curved since birth, and her lungs always too weak to breathe on their own. Her mother always placed her on her belly so Faye would not choke. As she grew, her legs went inward, knees knocking against each other. Still, she walked and fell and got up again. Her scabby knees were a sign of more than a clumsy toddler, and so they placed metal rods to guide her legs into place. Then her feet stopped developing, and so they put steel shoes on her feet to weight her down. Soon her eyes gave up and were too weak, and so they placed rounded glass on each eye, enlarging them to help her see. Faye wobbled down the street, each step heavy and mechanical, each look like a fish in its bowl. Feeling like a superhero, she ran, jumped without fear, for once equipped to live on this earth. Children often pointed and laughed, but she did not care. She knew this was only a suit for this earth, one that would come off when she went back to her real home. She dreamed of the day she would float by the lightness of her feet and see with her soul. Her body might have been modified for this earth, but her behavior was not something anyone could control. Faye spoke at an earlier age than most, full sentences, sometimes other languages. She had conversations when no one was around, and served Coca-Cola and saltines as she hosted her invisible friends. It's just a face, everyone said, but it never passed. Instead, she began to act quite oddly, whispering her secrets to the flowers and talking to the dogs with her eyes. Soon enough, she started to ask her own questions, feeling more out of place than ever before, each day desiring to be home. She sought answers from her mother. ¿Por qué soy más morena que tú? She asked her mother daily. ¿Mi quieres? Always followed. ¿Por qué mis brazos no son como los tuyos? Referring to her unusually hairy arms. ¿Mi quieres? Was always the last question as she fell asleep holding on to her mother's hand, never feeling settled and always feeling missing. Faye began to test her abilities. She knew she was not an ordinary child. She began to predict the weather and move objects with her mind. She could tell when someone was sad and feel their heart. She began to question if her mother was her own. She couldn't possibly be the daughter of a mother so angry. Faye was always in trouble, always being told no. Her mother never let her show her gifts. Faye was discouraged from playing with animals, discouraged from crying when others cried, always told to be clean, never play with the insects that follow her or the flowers that bloomed beside her. One day, Faye had enough of the world that rejected her. She decided it was time to plan her escape. Every day, she packed what she thought was practical and important. She stuffed a fresh pack of galletas Marias into Yakults into a small baby blue suitcase with metal clasps. This should be enough to sustain me on my travels, she thought to herself. The blue satin pocket inside held a tin box full of buttons, each unique in its own way. They once belonged to her earthly grandmother's old garments, but Faye took on the task to guard them. Some buttons bigger than others, none alike, none less valuable, golden like coins and encrusted with precious jewels. Among the other things Faye always packed was a sweater in case it got cold and a pair of white socks in case she had to travel in the rain. The lace that adorned them made her feel pretty despite the blocky shoes that slowed her down. She looked at her suitcase each day and evaluated, ensuring that all that was precious to her was held within. You see, the treasures in a suitcase are the most important. They will help you tell the story of where you came from, how far you have traveled, and remind you of your past life. As each day passed, and no one came to rescue her, she laid in her bed thinking of what her life was supposed to be. Faye prayed that someone was looking for her, and the night would come when they would come through the window and take her away. Faye placed a suitcase under her bed, just in case that night was the one. Her mother thought this was all a game, and said, "Tienes mucha imaginación." But Faye was certain that it was not her imagination. No, she was certain of her switch at her birth. The reasons are still unknown, but there are several theories. Somewhere out there is my real family, one that loves me. Faye mumbled, as having a suitcase is only the beginning of leaving a place behind. Before going on any adventure, you must accept that you might never come back. You must always be ready to leave, sometimes without saying goodbye. Faye was okay with that. She was certain no one would ever miss her. One day, Mama will come call my name, and I will not come. She will come to my room, search for me in my tent, push aside my clothes in the closet, and not find me. She will notice my blue suitcase gone, and then she will cry and wish she had told me she loved me. She will be sorry and cry for me. She will look at my picture and know I left for good, Faye thought to herself, and replayed the scenario over and over in her mind. On the days Faye lied about going to her aunt's house to play, she practiced leaving, all part of her training, as she called it. This was her way of ensuring she would not hesitate to leave when the time came. A forest was at the end of the block, and a river that ran through the trees. Each time Faye practiced, she was further away than the last. Each time she imagined what was deep within the forest. Each time she ran back before it went completely dark. But one day she would not return. The night would fall and she would be far away, far enough to not hear her name called, far enough not to be found. Faye had enough and devised a most brilliant plan. Faye would leave during her mother's daily afternoon naps, as she was always tired. She planned to escape then, to grab her suitcase, put on her shoes, and walk out the door. On the day of her planned escape, it was a particularly sunny day. Perfect for traveling, Faye thought to herself. It was lunchtime, and Faye wished Mama was a better cook so she could take some of the food with her, or at least travel with a full belly. Instead, she pushed away her plate. "I'm full." Her mother glared at her, but accepted the plate. Faye never really had the taste buds for most human food anyway. She often rejected everything her mother cooked. After dinner, Mama announced, "Me voy a dormir. Ven tú también." Faye frowned. "I'm not sleepy. Can I play with my paper dolls?" "No, vente a dormir," her mother ordered. Faye wondered if she knew her plan. "No, Mama. No, Ma, please. I'm not sleepy," Faye whined, hoping she would give up and let her be. "Ven para acá," she demanded. As Faye climbed into bed, she was reeled in and entangled by her mother's arms and legs. Faye wiggled and groaned, trying to escape her mother's embrace. Faye's mother then made her a deal to appease her. "If you do not fall asleep in 60 seconds, you can leave. Just count," her mother instructed. "Okay," Faye responded, sure she would win. Time passed, more than 60 seconds. Faye opened her eyes to darkness. She lay on the bed, alone, and all she could see was the light that came through the cracks of the bedroom door. She realized she had failed at her mother's game. That night, she drew another escape plan. The solution was clear: to leave before anyone was awake to see her. This time, there would be no one to stop her. And so, Faye went to bed, dreaming of the new life that awaited her. She thought of the friends she would make, imagined what her real mother looked like, and thought of her as a fairy, the queen of the fairies. Faye drifted into her dream and received her own wings and her crown as her mother's princess. Mousy friends who lived within the trees prepared a special drink for Faye to drink and shrunk her to their size. She went to their tiny parties and sat in their chairs and drank from their tiny cups made of walnuts. She lay on a bed of grass and was covered by a blanket made of webs. The pillows were flower buds, and lightning bugs illuminated her room. She felt home for once, like she belonged, but most importantly, she felt loved. Morning came, but the sun was just rising. There was no time to waste, but for the first time, Faye wanted to say goodbye. She distracted her thoughts, but thinking of the home that awaited her reminded her what she had to leave. Faye gathered her suitcase once again, opened it to ensure all she needed was there. She snapped it shut and walked to the door. She undid the bolt and turned the knob slowly. Faye stepped out to the cold morning air. All was still colored blue, but the light of the sun and its warmth could be felt. One could hear the birds sing, talking to each other about their plans for the day. Faye closed the door behind her slowly and stopped it from slamming. Faye began to walk towards the forest and wanted to look back. She knew that if she did, she would regret it and all her bravery would go away. So she kept walking, and soon she could hear the current of the river. The water was wild and rushing, pushing the rocks and the leaves out of its way. Each step Faye took, she could feel closer to home than ever before. Soon, her legs began to feel constrained. She took off the metal brace that surrounded her waist and the metal rods that guided her legs. Her spine aligned and began to walk in a straight line. Her feet began to feel heavier than usual. So, she set her suitcase down and removed her steel shoes and replaced them with her white lace socks. As she kept walking, her sight became blurry. So she removed the rounded glass from each eye and placed it on top of a rock. Faye did not see anything magical or extraordinary yet, but her body knew where it was heading. She came to the path that led to a hill. Faye climbed up and held on to the grass that covered it. Upon descent, she decided to roll her body down. She giggled at every turn until she stopped and saw a stone road. Not gray and broken pavement with broken glass like she had seen before. No, this road was made of different sized stones, none alike, just like her mother's buttons. The stones, each surrounded by bright moss and peeking flowers, felt like a carpet under her toes. The mist that fell that morning wet her socks, but the softness welcomed each step she took. The town was silent until Faye heard the sounds of water splashing and spilling from a white marble fountain. The water that flowed was clean and pristine. The bottom of the fountain was adorned by mosaic of every color, like precious jewels. They shone as the sun hit the water. The immense peace overwhelmed Faye, and she realized she had arrived at her true home. She walked through a secret portal that only those who belonged can enter. She continued to walk and go deeper within the village that was part of her new kingdom. There were chickens running without an owner, and brick houses with tin roofs and gardens surrounding them. Towards the middle of her kingdom, there was a green gazebo, surrounded by yellow and white flowers with yellow buds at its center. Faye sat on a bench with her suitcase at her side to decide what to do next. There was a loud, hypnotizing ringing of brass. Faye thought there were church bells and walked towards them. The church was like no other she had ever seen before. The church was surrounded by pink trees and lush grass. The church was entirely made of white stone and had golden doors. Faye identified it as her castle and the bells announcing her arrival. Faye was finally home and a new life awaited. The world she had left behind never accepted her, judged her for being special, and rejected her gifts. Now she could reign as the princess she knew she was all along. Thinking about meeting her new family excited her, And so she grabbed her suitcase and ran to the church doors. She imagined the feast set out for her, one that she would enjoy. She thought of the joyful dancing that would follow, and the balloons and the confetti that would fall upon her once she walked through the golden doors. Faye stood in front of the doors, knocked lightly, but no one came to greet her. So she knocked harder, with a little closed fist. When no light went on through the stained glass windows, and no one answered her call, Faye began to worry. And so Faye put her little blue suitcase down and banged as hard as she could with both hands. When no one let her in, she began to kick the door in frustration. Faye took 5 steps back and took a big breath, held it in, enlarging her cheeks, and blew as hard as she could. But she was powerless in this world. The golden doors remained shut for her. She ran her little body against the door, but nothing happened. Her eyes began to water, and tears fell from her eyes onto her warm cherub cheeks. She did not sob or cry out. Her sorrow went much deeper. What does this mean? She thought. For if she did not belong to that world, nor this one, where could she be safe? Where could she lay her head? Where would she be loved? She stopped, wiped her tears with both hands, stepped back, and stuck her tongue out at the grandiose church building. "Ya no te quiero!" she yelled as far as she could. The birds perched on the pink trees flew in fear of Faye. She grabbed her suitcase and began to miss her earthly mama, and wonder if she missed her too. Faye began to run back. She crossed the green gazebo, past the white marble fountain, and ran up the grass hill, walked through the woods, and exited the magical forest. Faye found her rounded glass for the eyes and placed them on her face, laced her steel shoes back on, and secured to her waist her metal brace that guided her legs. She was glad they still fit her body, and even felt comfortable for once. She ran back home, feeling like centuries had passed. Faye was surprised to find the ordinary door of her earthly home just a bit ajar. She wondered if anyone missed her, if her mama would welcome her back. Faye walked through the door, and the house was still sleeping. There was no sound but the fans that sat on the windowsill of their small house. The bedroom door was still closed, so Faye walked back to the room, unpacked, took off her shoes, undid her brace, and removed the rounded glass from her face. Faye went under the covers with her mama and embraced her. She understood that her purpose was always to be on this earth and placed in this family for a reason. She vowed to protect her mama with all her gifts and save her from herself. One day, Faye would help her, and they'd both go on an adventure together to a new world. Faye would be there to teach her how to pack.
El Viejo Guepardo by Luis G. de Felipe Villa. Read by Kirk Lua.
Con los años, el guepardo albino había perdido la endiablada velocidad y el fino oído que caracteriza a su especie. Conocería de verdad el hambre. Muchas de sus presas conseguían escapar antes de que un zarpazo las detuviese. Incluso hubo noches en las que soñó con el sabor intenso de la carne fresca. Las fuerzas le abandonaban. Su paso se hizo lento a través de las llanuras del Serengeti. Sin embargo, se resistía a dejar el mundo. Tal vez, en cierto modo, intuía que era único entre los suyos, una rareza que no volvería a repetirse en mucho tiempo. Es mucho más probable que solo fuese el hambre y el impulso ciego de la vida por llevar a cabo las labores 1000 veces repetidas. lo que le llevara a seguir caminando, buscando, golpeteando. Ha visto el antílope mucho antes de que el viejo cazador y su nieto le avistasen a él. Emprendió el acercamiento con cautela, poniendo al servicio de su estómago la experiencia de sus cicatrices. Tendría que acercarse mucho, arriesgarlo todo para asegurar una carrera de distancia corta. Esta vez la presa no podía escaparse. Llevaba muchos días sin comer. El viejo cazador se llevó un rifle al hombro. Enfocó el guepardo albino a través de la mira telescópica, calculó la distancia y la velocidad del viento, corrigió la mira y siguió atento las evoluciones del animal. Cuando éste se tensó como una cuerda de piano para saltar sobre el antílope, disparó. El guepardo se impulsó para echar a correr. No oyó el disparo, pero vio cómo el antílope recibía el balazo en las extremidades posteriores, impidiéndole la huida. Cubrió la distancia que les separaba. Hizo presa en la carne con sus garras y cerró los dientes en torno al cuello desprotegido. Carne fresca, al fin. El nieto miraba a su abuelo con los ojos muy abiertos. Satisfecho, el viejo cazador accionó el cerrojo del arma y un casquillo humeante voló por los aires. Luego, al ver la expresión de su nieto, le dijo con una sonrisa: a veces, los viejos cazadores tienen que ayudarse.
A Beat to Hold by Elena Liu. Read by Sherilyn Colgrove.
Find that rhythm older than the blushing sky, which drives you forward as the end seems nigh. Through fields of thorn and rubble high, it's that pum 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 keeping you alive. Find that rhythm when the songbird cries for all her chicks gone out to fly, a prayer to send them safe and dry. It's that tit 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 setting them to thrive. Find that rhythm brought by the tide, where cherubs push without their guise, to seek what humanity tries to hide. It's that tap 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 backing all surprise. Find that rhythm where the old buck lies, with simple cause to his demise. The watcher paces, pins, and bites. It's that dun, dun, dun before he dies. Find that rhythm down low inside, that stirs when you wake and grows as you rise. That source of your vigor, potential, and pride. It's that thump, 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 the eternal prize.
Mi Razón de Andar by Rebecca Cuevas Rosas. Read by Susan Guzman.
Mi razón de andar. Me pregunto, ¿de dónde viene mi afinidad por el campo, por las montañas, los valles, las cataratas y el vasto y hermoso desierto? ¿Vendrá de mi sangre y la vida que vivieron mis antepasados? ¿Vendrá de mi necesidad de desaparecer en lo silvestre de ellos y ellas que araron los campos y cazaron las bestias que comen al ganado? ¿O será que la obsesión del americano con el bosque virgen ha infiltrado mi psique? ¿Será que soy una mini colonizadora confundida porque mi piel es blanca y no morena? ¿Será que me creo dueña de la tierra en la cual vago porque estoy en luto por el suelo que perdí al emigrar? ¿O será que me creo dueña de este pedazo de suelo porque se me ha metido que es mi derecho andar? ¿Será que mi ADN anhela el suelo fresco bajo la sombra de la capirera de mi rancho en Michoacán y se conforma con la alfombra roja de hojas caídas en los secuoyas en California? ¿Y qué opción hay? ¿Ceder a los antojos de mi sangre y vivir como esperaba mi ADN? ¿O acepto la transformación achicana, ni mexicana ni americana, un nuevo tipo de mestiza que sé no sabe su razón de andar?
The Green World is Calling and She Must Go, by Madeline Dax Wilson. Read by the author.
William Shakespeare never came closer in his career to earning the title of feminist than with the tragedy Othello. Although popular scholarship on the play concerns itself chiefly with the racial othering of the titular character, ascribing his downfall to the venomous tongues of Venetian society, Othello is not the first fatality of the story, and his own prejudices are what direct him down the path that leads to Desdemona's murder. In the first two acts of his late career play, Shakespeare condemns the early modern fixation with assigning women their identity based on an imagined binary, the virgin or the whore, by using Othello's inability to view an entire gender outside of this dichotomy as a trait of tragedy that ultimately predicts his doom. From the play's outset, descriptions of Desdemona and her speeches detailing her elopement paint her as a particularly level-headed and empathic player in the Venice of Shakespeare's story. Her blamelessness in the face of her untimely murder allows her to stand in for women at large being overzealously sorted into one of the two identities allowed to them, virgin or whore, and her decision to keep Othello's betrayal to herself establishes her as a martyr for this cause. Her passionate plea to the senators of Venice, quote, that she did love the more to live with him, end quote, illuminates the inherently contradictory and thus intrinsically doomed nature of Desdemona and Othello's relationship. When they marry, Desdemona is unquestionably innocent, both in her sexual inexperience and limited knowledge of the world outside of Venice. Upon eloping with Othello, she expects to quickly rectify both of these points as they begin their life together. The very thing that bonds them, despite its foreignness to her, is what she expects to gain through their marriage: worldly experience. Once she begins to acquire this, Othello cannot help but project onto her the shame and guilt that he has been trained to associate with innocence lost in women. The explanation Othello offers for how the pair falls in love shocks the Venetians hearing it, for the same reason it endears the audience to the couple. Their marriage is built on an exchange, not one of wealth or value, but of stories for compassion. Although this initially reflects a sense of strength in their burgeoning relationship, since their connection comes from a distinctly internal place, there is an unspoken expectation that each character will continue to play their respective part once married. And this limitation of personal growth becomes their downfall. Desdemona's innocence is what fosters Othello's devotion. The idea of her losing this virginal quality disrupts his worldview so completely that it creates a fissure in his mental guard, and Iago takes advantage of this vulnerability. In fact, innocence, chastity, and virtue are such interconnected ideas in reference to Elizabethan woman that the moment Othello senses any change within his wife, it immediately sends him into an ambiguous distress, and he welcomes an explanation for this subconscious panic in any form, even extreme and uncharacteristic betrayal. What Othello neglects to realize is that Desdemona chooses experience and autonomy long before she steps foot on the battlefront in Cyprus. From her first entrance into the play, after eloping with the man she loves, Othello, Desdemona speaks for herself. When the story begins, the most betrayed and least lamenting person on the stage is Desdemona. The first act of the play takes place on her wedding night, yet directly after speaking their vows and convincing politicians of their right to be in love, her newly ordained husband gets a military assignment overseas, and any planned celebration or consummation is postponed. In her plea to the Venetian politicians to allow her to follow her husband to Cyprus, she speaks in deeply religious terms to address the rights she refuses to be cheated of, and Shakespeare grants her the dual rhetorical power of having rational thought guided entirely by emotional impulses. Her union with Othello becomes something, quote, consecrated, end quote, and were she to be left behind in Venice, her, quote, rights would be, quote, bereft of her. Through this dialogue, Desdemona owns up to her shortcomings as a daughter while asserting that her claim to a happy, sexually fulfilled marriage is divinely given. Desdemona also relates her relationship to Othello back to the natural order of the world. Her turn has come to love a husband as her mother did her father, emotionally as well as physically. By first establishing the legitimacy of her claims and giving her passion credence so she can break free of the trope of the overly emotional woman, Desdemona pronounces her agency and gains the permission she seeks to follow Othello to Cyprus and seek her own adventure. Experience, then, must be considered as another rite of marriage. Throughout the play, their consummation is oft alluded to, but never satisfied. Because of this oversight, Desdemona's eventual murder on the couple's wedding sheets, no less, becomes a stand-in climax both in the narrative and in their relationship. Othello's experiences as a slave and a child raised in warfare are what first endear him to Desdemona. It is a life wrought with adventure that contrasts her own upbringing enough to make her yearn for it. Were she to be left in Venice when Othello leaves for Cyprus, not only would she be cheated of her singular wedding night rights, but also of her chance to share his experiences. She likens herself, left behind in Venice, to a, quote, moth in peace, end quote, drawing a parallel to a delicate insect in perpetual darkness, idle and deprived of its singular joy, its source of light. Desdemona's description of herself reflects deeply on her expectations of what marriage to Othello will bring her. A brand new world to explore and engage with, where peace is a disappointment. From the moment she boards a ship to Cyprus and gets tossed by foreign waves, she begins to grow and change as a person. Gaining experience is an inevitability, but Othello's mental image of his wife as the virgin remains static. Because the Desdemona who arrives is not the woman who wept over his life anecdotes that were so different from her own, and because she now has the diplomatic responsibilities of a high-ranking military wife, she no longer resembles the image Othello has of her in his mind. In order to reconcile Desdemona's newfound agency with his dichotomous view of women, Othello must categorize his wife as a whore, a subconscious switch that Iago latches onto, and that serves as the turning point for the fate of the pair. Shakespeare's story has lived many lives since it was written in the early 17th century, and analysis of it should always highlight the two ways of interacting with the text, as a piece of literature and in performance. The 2013 production of Othello at the National Theatre in London nimbly illustrates the imbalance of innocence and experience as the fundamental flaw in Desdemona and Othello's relationship, while maintaining a sense of real intimacy and devotion between the pair. The actor Olivia Vinall brings a playfulness to her role and to her characters' relationships that manifests as a young but nuanced Desdemona who lands at Cyprus, the picture of a child heading off to summer camp, complete with an oversized backpack and a military helmet tucked under her arm. Vinall's delivery of her plea to the Venetian senators masks her innocent desire to tag along with her new husband on his deployment behind a powerful appeal to be allowed her basic rights as a wife. Her youth and inherent kindness are paramount to her portrayal of a newly married woman, newly estranged from her only parent, who successfully implores a room full of men to let her embark alongside her husband to a war zone. Only in fleeting moments does her desperation to be alongside Othello, so she might have a great adventure of her own, slip through. Vinal slams the table at the end of the speech to punctuate Desdemona's point, and in doing so, ultimately convinces the room of her reasoning while seizing her autonomy from the grips of the Venetian patriarchy. Alongside Vinal, Adrian Lester plays an Othello that is initially unwilling to see Desdemona as anything other than a stagnant, virginal figure. When he meets her at Cyprus, however, the change in her is evident, and he becomes immediately vulnerable to Iago's persuasion. From then on, any sign of vitality and agency in Desdemona is immediately misconstrued as infidelity and a betrayal to the fictional, perennially innocent wife that Lester's Othello believes he married. Because the National Theatre's production uses visual cues like clothing and furniture from the 21st century military world, the contemporary relevance of the play's condemnation of binary thinking is present at all times throughout the performance. Centering the conversation about Othello's trajectory around the virgin or whore complex and analyzing his downfall through a feminist framework does not diminish the truth that is to be found in more common post-colonial readings of the text. When Desdemona ceases to fit into the box Othello had designated for her, he fails to reconcile the imagined version of Desdemona with her authentic, multifaceted identity, and he can no longer recognize her as the wife he loves. Before any of these doubts, however, Othello's own failure to stay inside the box Venetian society would have him occupy, a racial other and thus subservient, generates a foundation of the same ambiguous distress he experiences when Desdemona begins to break down his binary thinking towards women. By the time Othello's story is being told, he has internalized decades of cognitive dissonance surrounding his own liminal identity. In one of the play's most infamous lines, Othello is simultaneously praised and slandered when a senator commends him for behaving, quote, more fair than black, end quote, because his actions don't align neatly with his outwardly expressed identity. It's no great leap, then, for Iago's monstrous influence to take complete control of a man who is already disoriented by identity and hyper-aware that a person's exterior can conceal their true nature. The tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, is not that a husband kills his wife over a lie, a jealous misconception, but that the husband could not bear to recognize the liminal identity of his wife and of himself, a shared experience that could have united them in a world plagued with binary thinking.
Luz de Gas by Luis G. de Felipa Villa. Read by Kirk Lua.
Vengo por un túnel oscuro y lo único que me impide perderme es la llama de gas de un mechero. Hace frío, apenas siento los dedos. Solo tengo la voz para contarme cuentos y suena extraña rebotando en la pared del túnel, mientras la débil luz que brilla en mi mano arranca formas de las sombras, los ángulos de los ladrillos, la línea eterna que traza el suelo hacia mi salvación, espero, y mi voz entona. Hace muchos años, en un reino muy lejano, vivía un rey que tenía una hija, la princesa muy alta, que siempre tenía la cabeza en las nubes. La llama tiembla, agitada por un golpe de aire, y se me corta la inspiración. Ese aire, ¿de dónde ha venido? ¿Estoy cerca de una salida? Entonces se me corta la respiración, se me olvida la princesa y encamino mis pasos en la dirección de la ráfaga. Sin embargo, el camino se hace largo. No pasa mucho tiempo antes de que vuelve a oírme decir, Theressa una vez, en una isla donde vivían familias enteras de pescadores. Un joven huérfano que vivía en una cabaña aislada, hijo y nieto de pescadores, y pescador el mismo. ¿Estaré bien orientado? ¿Llegaré por aquí a la salida? No soy capaz de terminar ninguno de mis cuentos. ¿Será el frío que no deja volar la magia? ¿Serán mis dedos ateridos que acerco a la llama? Mi pequeña hada azul de oxígeno y gas. ¿Cuánto tiempo vas a durar? ¿Hasta cuándo me acompañarás? De nuevo empiezo a contar. En un país muy lejano nació una niña en una noche estrellada, entre la primavera y el verano. Sus padres eran dos pobres campesinos que a duras penas conseguían llevar un trozo de pan duro y un litro de leche a la mesa, día tras día. Pero al llegar la niña, la casa se llenó de risas y la vida les parecía más soportable. Mira qué regalo nos han hecho los cielos, solía decirle la madre a su marido. El eco de mi voz rebota arriba, abajo, a un lado y a otro, como las risas de la niña. Llenan un espacio que antes parecía vacío, sin calor, sin luz. ¿Conseguiré iluminar este sitio con mis cuentos? Espero que haya gas suficiente para encontrar la salida. Y mientras llego, mi voz sigue resonando, mis palabras volando. Mis cuentos van quedándose por el camino. Y no sé si conseguiré contar uno hasta el final, sin interrumpirme. Qué extraña es una voz contando cuentos por un túnel. Qué extraño el trovador perdido y armado con un sencillo mechero, con una débil luz de gas por lanza y estandarte. ¿Dónde estará la salida?
No Heat, No Light by Luis G. de Felipa Villa. Read by Marcos Hernandez.
I come through a dark tunnel, and the only thing preventing me from getting lost is the gas flame from a lighter. It's cold. I can hardly feel my fingers. I only have the voice to tell myself stories, and it sounds strange, bouncing off the wall of the tunnel, while the faint light that shines in my hand rips shapes out of the shadows, the angles of the bricks, the eternal line that traces the ground toward my salvation, I hope. And my voice narrates. Many years ago, in a very distant kingdom, there lived a king who had a daughter, Princess Tuhai, who always had her head in the clouds. The flame trembles, stirred by a sudden gust of air, and my inspiration goes out. That air, where'd it come from? Am I near an exit? Then my lungs give out. I forget the princess, and I aim my steps in the direction of the gust. However, the road is long. It isn't long before I hear myself speak again. Once upon a time, on an island where entire families of fishermen lived, a young orphan who lived in an isolated cabin, the son and grandson of fishermen, and a fisherman himself. Am I guiding myself faithfully? Will I be led to the exit? I'm not capable of finishing any of my stories. It's the cold, which does not let magic fly. It's my fingers, stiff from the cold, which I bring closer to the flame. My little blue fairy of oxygen and gas. How long will you last? How long will you stay with me? Once again, I start to narrate. In a very distant country, a girl was born on a starry night between spring and summer. Her parents were two poor peasants who barely managed to bring a piece of stale bread and a liter of milk to the table day after day. But when the girl arrived, the house was filled with laughter, and life seemed more bearable. Look at what a gift the heavens have given us, her mother would tell her husband. The echo of my voice bounces up, down, to one side and to the other, like the girl's laughter fills a space that previously seemed empty. No heat, no light. Will I be able to illuminate this place with my stories? I hope there's enough gas to find my way out. And in the meantime, my voice continues to ring and my words fly. My stories fall by the wayside, and I don't know if I'll be able to tell one to the end without interrupting myself. How strange, a voice telling stories through a tunnel. How strange, the troubadour, lost and armed with a simple lighter, with a weak gas light for lance and banner. Where will the exit be?
My Own George Ella Lyon by Sarah M. Fett. Read by Alexandria Weber.
I am from late night walks and the unsupervised, from dim streetlights and little compromise. I am from my brother's scars and my mother's worries, from her father's glass and her mother's fury. I am from where seas meet land, and death is timely, from where stars meet sky and black is nightly. I am from barbed wire and white picket fences, from in-between and heavy consequences. I am from nowhere and everywhere, from under and above, from daydreams and nightmares, built from tough love.
T. Bombardeo by Theressa Matos-Acevedo. Read by the author.
Te bombardeo con artículos de catástrofes en nuestra isla. Porque como no te importa, a mí tampoco me importa bombardear tu pantalla con titulares nocivos, los cuales solo nosotros tiramos el ay bendito. Solo nosotros sentimos el mira para allá, mientras ustedes miran para allá. Ya, basta de la misma historia. Ya, basta de los mismos cuentos. Ya, suficiente tenemos con la otra mejilla, rosa y ardiendo. ¿Querés que agradezcamos? ¿Que nos arrodillamos a tu nombre? ¿A tus manos que aclamas tener abiertas? Pero la dura verdad es contradictoria. ¿Metafóricamente abiertas a la caridad? Más bien limosna, al turismo colonial, al no tener misericordia. Para el golpe final, demasiado a la República le gusta impulsar el mismo cuento de historia errónea para que sea el último puñal. Ay, pero basta ya. Te bombardeo.
Boat de Miu by Dale Stromberg, read by Araya Lentini.
Our investigation finds it suspicious that we investigated you. Our farm was suffering. The rains poured down in August and floods rushed across the meadows and carried off the topsoil. Nothing would grow. To firm up the soil, you got the idea to introduce four-leafed owl grass. The grass roots would interlock and hold the soil together, and it worked. But the four-leafed owl grass grew out of control and began to choke off the crops. So I got the idea to introduce African rock weevils. The rock weevils would chew up the roots of the owl grass and kill it off. And it worked. But the black bullfrogs that feed on rock weevils began to breed like wildfire. And black bullfrog dung is copper-rich and gets into the water, and then the oxen get diarrhea and won't breed. So you got the idea to introduce diamondback pythons to eat the bullfrogs. And it worked. But diamondback pythons' mating calls are high-pitched and shrill, and they spook the chickens so that they stop laying eggs. So I got the idea to introduce cotton foxes to eat the python eggs. And it worked. But cotton foxes also eat the water bugs that usually clear the ponds of algae. The algae flourished and blocked up the sluices and canals to the farms. The topsoil, lacking moisture, dried out and loosened, and the next time the autumn rains came, the topsoil was washed away. So you suggested four-leafed owl grass? And I replied, what other choice do we have?
Signs by Catherine Sadakierski, read by the author.
Summer's last listless drops of honey are drowsily squeezed out, the languid days shortening, each day a slice cut from a bread loaf, gradually dwindling to crumbs, that we try to pick up, leaving a trail of memories like Hansel and Gretel, trying to retrace these steps in hopes that mapping the past might illuminate the shadowy silhouettes of the future, making it clearer. A sunspot dimples the endless expanse of road curving ahead, flecked like a dapple of shiny paint on an empty canvas, splayed like pancake batter stretching across a skillet. It is a ray breaking through the copse of trees whose golden manes reflect the tufts of cloud quaffing the soft blue sky as the crimson underbellies of the birds in their midst flash gold, refracting the light, their folds, dimensions, angular wings like creases of paper giving life to origami cranes. Life, in other words, has a way of luminescing new perspectives each new day, showing you the way forward, a birth bookending every conclusion as another sun rises and the morning begins, dawning again.
Los Amantes Pasados by William J. Cordero, read by Susan Guzman.
Los amantes pasados. Dos ancianitos se sientan en el patio de la clínica de reposo, uno con un bastón tallado y la otra en una silla de ruedas. Hace muchos años se divorciaron del otro. Pero ahora ellos han olvidado todo. Ahí ella escucha a un pájaro carpintero derrotando lentamente un poste de madera deshuesada lo que es como una colmena acribillada. Mientras tanto, él, encandilado, mira un colibre verde se sumerge adentro de una flor de cempasúchil. Los pájaros van a sus quehaceres, haciendo el mundo ambos más fértil y más decadente. Y se coquetean de nuevo una primera vez.
Old Flames by William J. Cordero, read by Rachel O'Shaughnessy.
Two little old people sit in the courtyard of a nursing home, one with a carved walking stick and the other in a wheelchair. Many years ago, these two divorced each other. But now they have forgotten everything. She listens to a woodpecker, slowly defeating a wooden fence post pockmarked like a riddled hive. Dazed, he sees a green hummingbird dip into blossoming marigolds. The birds go about their chores of making the world both more fertile and decayed, and the couple flirts again for the first time.
Old Flames by William J. Cordero. Read by Yuan Changming.
老相好。两个瘦小的老人坐在敬老院的亭内，一个拄着雕花手杖，一个坐在轮椅上。多年前，他们就彼此离了婚。不过眼下他们忘记了一切。他听着啄木鸟深深敲打着伤痕累累、蜂房般千疮百孔的木栓柱。茫然间，他瞥见一只绿蜂鸟在盛开的金盏花间倏然一掠。鸟儿们一如往常，忙着把世界变得更加肥沃和腐烂，而这对男女又一次开始了调情。
Last Chance by Carol Alexander. Read by Natalie Acuna.
This is it, ocean says, and land, twisted roots and arsenic, your mandrake baby, boomtown bust, gold flakes in the throat. Prepare to be nothing after heat and dust. Nomads teach the art of summer exodus, caterpillar tent of woven nettle rags. A single word for rain and snow is what? Sky stain or hellfellow. It's hard to find a nautilus shell large enough to compass the brain, but you must get out of this body somehow. Maybe a jellyfish. The angel foams up on a crest, a big wave surfer demanding how many turns you've cleansed of oil, whales you've spared, and why in your selfish heart were you always hungering after northern lights? A dipper of water equals exotic pleasure. Once you've shimmied down a well and licked the stones as terrified grown-ups called your name.
Pursuing by Yuan Changming. Read by the author.
In a world always half in darkness, your body may be soaked deep in a nightmare, rotting. But your heart can roam like a synchronous satellite in outer space, leaving the long night far behind. As long as your heart flies fast and high enough, you will live a life of light forever. 追求。在一半是黑暗的世界，我的躯体在噩梦中浸泡、腐烂，而我的心却像从不卫星那样在高空翱翔，把长夜远远甩在身后。是的，只要我的心飞得够高、够快，我就会永享光明。
From the Darkness They Came by Gabriel C. País. Read by Marcos Hernandez.
This piece is dedicated to the memory of Camila, a devoted Guatemalan mother who sought justice but was denied life. All stories in this title are true as related to me by the people affected. Names and some details have been changed to protect their privacy. Snow accumulated on the front steps of the school building that early morning on Keeler Street. The scraping of shovels on sidewalks and hissing of CTA buses is how the West Side wakes in the winter. When I first saw Jocelyn, the temperature hadn't yet topped 10 degrees, but the Chicago public school system doesn't shut down unless it's colder than -15. It was my 6th year teaching, and by then I had learned the subtle signs of migrant families in distress, disoriented and cold in a world away from their own. What gave it away first was her clothes, worn across continents and climate zones. She wore cheap jean print pants that cut off right above the ankle. Her short-sleeved shirt revealed dark arms naked in the polar blast, hands and fingers molded by years of hard manual labor. Her chest recoiled from the Martian cold of midwinter Chicago as she hugged herself in pain. She and her girls had come a long way from Honduras. I hadn't yet noticed the ice ankle brace locked into place, a clunky black box protruding from her lower leg, marking her as a border crosser. Her accomplishment was Olympian. She traversed the Central American peninsula, all of Guatemala, up through Mexico, and crossed the border into the United States on foot with her 3 young daughters, no coyote, cheating death in every nook. Many more of my students' families had crossed too, leaving everything behind, leaping into the unknown, living under the table, part of the 11 million undocumented people in the county. These mothers despised the tracking devices around their ankles. Me siento como un animal, Geraldo's mom, Camila, said as she fantasized about cutting through its tough, adjustable strap. It humiliated her, like a leash, but she could be deported for removing it. She found that the local tiendas and taquerias would deny her employment for wearing it. No one wanted to draw attention from La Migra. She begged me to help her find a job. Tengo que pagar una deuda, si no mi familia en Guatemala sufrirá. Her words hung ominously. An unpaid debt meant blood, so I introduced her to Anna's mom, Gladys, who offered her $50 a week to help out with the tamales food cart in Humboldt Park. Their hands pressed masa with unstoppable clapping as they molded pockets of spicy green pork tamales sold for $1 each. Lines of construction workers with tired eyes lined up each dawn to buy them by the dozen, steaming from plastic bags. Camila learned how to make Mexican tamales in their straw-colored corn husks, distinctly different from the banana leaf ones she knew so well from Guatemala. They'd hand me a vegetarian batch, sometimes with piping hot atole to drink as payment for translating parent meetings and school functions. Many never went to school, but they'd be damned if they couldn't understand their kids' teachers. It would be a few months before Jocelyn returned to school again, with 3 daughters. Her youngest was still too little for school, but Karina and Natalia had missed almost a year of education. She had been turned away from registering the girls after undertrained front office staff demanded proof of vaccinations for her kids before enrolling them. La migra me tomó los documentos, she explained. In reality, because the family was in a temporary housing situation, they should have been registered without precondition. The girls unnecessarily missed months more of schooling as Jocelyn took up work at different plastic factories in Chicago's west suburbs for $9 an hour so she could pay for their shots. She rode 2 buses past abandoned warehouses, sidewalks lined with memorial candles, and the giant Coca-Cola plant on Division and Cicero, where the Humboldt Park and Austin neighborhoods meet. She went to different factories each night, depending on where temp work was needed. Everyone knew a friend or cousin who needed work. The only catch was a Social Security card, which could be bought for about $115 by asking around. I warned Jocelyn never to have it on her, especially when going to her immigration check-ins and court dates. Lo enterraré detrás de mi casa, she assured me, despite the unthawed frozen ground, hard like cement. That little blue card stopped her family from starving, but would mean an accelerated lane to deportation if found. Using a falsified or copied Social Security card for work is a felony and is a common reason for expedited deportation proceedings. ICE agents look for these in every crevice of the body. She would be sent back to Honduras if they found it. The girls were left alone in a shoddy apartment with unfinished inside walls as their mom worked each night. Her eldest daughter, Karina, was left in charge of the two smaller kids while their mom worked to afford vaccines, about $120 per child. She was a 13-year-old with severe black eyes, a dark complexion like her mother's, and taller than most of the kids in her class. Her face carried a childish and whole-cheeked meekness, yet bore the worry and interruption of displacement. At school, she had stomach pain and anxiety attacks, which worsened in her all-English classroom. She listened to a Musica Cristiana playlist on her mom's phone to calm down. I learned how to thoughtfully write her journal prompts. Some topics were off the table. No talk of death, no talk of when she had crossed. Karina surprised me when I asked her what she wanted to work as. Quiero estudiar idiomas, she said. Una lingüista, I taught her. She had missed much of the school year, but was academically on par with most of her 7th grade class. Her sister, Natalia, was in 4th grade, also ahead of the class, and was learning English by the hour. She forged a friendship with a 3rd grade girl from Guatemala with silver teeth and long black braids. In the dust storm of displacement, the kids forged a small place for themselves, whispering and giggling to each other. Feeling comfort for the first time in months, they slowly learned again how to be children. During the prior school year in Honduras, members of a local gang demanded that Karina carry small bags of cocaine into her school. They likely figured that a young girl with no criminal background would arouse less suspicion. Once home, she told her mom what happened, speaking only in a whisper, as if the bandileros were in her walls. Jocelyn knew what turning down the Mara meant. She was powerless to save her daughters as long as they stayed in Honduras. The country had devolved into a U.S.-sponsored narco-dictatorship under President Juan Orlando Hernandez, and she was on the bottom of it, as a nearly illiterate single mother born into ravaging poverty, and there was certainly no money to pay the police for protection. When Karina didn't show up to school for a week, 2 teen boys went to her house and marked the entire family for killing with 3 small squares spray-painted on their corrugated wall. They also identified the house as one without a man. The images of her gutted and raped daughters must have done it. Jocelyn decided in that moment to leave everything as it was, lock the doors, and head north. She gathered her life savings of about $90 and burned a candle in prayer. Camila and her sons, Geraldo and Alejandro, left Guatemala after her estranged husband pulled a gun on them and pressed a machete to her throat. 10 years of domestic abuse culminated one hot night in a poor neighborhood of Champerico, a gritty port city on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. He was arrested after shooting his gun into the air while trying to kill his oldest son, Alejandro. After hearing that a hired killer was after them and that her abuser was out of jail, Camila agreed to pay a coyote $8,000 for passage to the United States, reasoning that it was safer to be guided than to go alone. She had heard of the women and children kidnapped, robbed, murdered, raped, abandoned, and disappeared in the thick of the Sonoran Desert, left for the vultures to devour. A different mom once told me that she crossed years ago and was kept in a crowded hut in the desert for days with a group of miserable and sick people. Outside there was a shallow pit with a woman's decomposing body in it, her black hair sprouting from the gravel and sand like a desert plant. In Guatemala, Camila worked as a mobile food vendor, frying potatoes and chicken on the street for 10 quetzales a serving, and on most days, she just about broke even. The cost of her passage guaranteed her a life of debt. Poverty she could handle. A machete to her throat, she could not. They crossed into Ciudad Hidalgo, far south in the Mexican Chiapas state, and were herded back into the back of an open-top semi-truck. Border guards were paid off to look the other way. Women were separated from men. Les rogué por mi hijo, she told me, and eventually she was allowed to keep Gerardo with her. She thought of him as her sensitive boy, soft-spoken and sincere. They traveled back roads for 3 days under the striking sun. The truck bounced along curved mountainous roads, edging over precipices, past rusted and ruined carcasses of cars and vans looted of anything that could be sold as scrap metal. They ate dust bouncing through Chihuahua State towards the border on their last evening, when the truck was pulled over by Mexican federal police, who tapped their batons on the outside of the trailer, creating a fearful echo like a massive broken bell, which woke the wary bunch inside. Within striking distance of the U.S. border, the police pulled them down from the truck and lined them up along the highway in plastic zip-tie handcuffs. They beat the driver, ordering payment, peaje as they called it. Bribes of $100 were demanded for each passenger, which Camila did not have. A one-eyed stranger, who also traveled north, offered to pay a lesser amount for her and her kids. He gave a golden ring as payment for himself, which the police happily accepted. The truck was allowed onward, creaking towards the United States. The metallic trailer reflected the desert sun's last rays. It rolled on, full of desperation, rosaries, and last hopes. They came to a sharp halt. Darkness meant time to walk. With small plastic bottles of soda and some warm water, blankets thrown over shoulders, sleeping toddlers, mouthed words of prayer, darkness deepened. The task now was to walk or to die. Jocelyn and her 3 girls left Honduras, passing through Guatemala on a series of old, refurbished school buses painted bright like a sailor's tattoos. Tires hugged the edges of the unguarded mountain roads, shared with an assortment of basket-bearing women, stray dogs, and burning piles of trash. In Guatemala City, they disembarked the defeated bus, stinking of burnt rubber. The next bus to Huehuetenango and towards the Mexican border left at 5 a.m. the next morning. She laid her smallest one on a sheet of cardboard upon the steps of a church for the short night. After another day on the road, they transferred to an overweight pickup truck that poured black smoke into their 4th night of travel. Strangers nodded to each other in the dark, whispering just over golden teeth. The pickup truck took them into Mexico, from where many would never leave. In a smidgen of a town in southern Chiapas, Jocelyn spent her last few pesos on a stick of butter with a loaf of white Bimbo bread and a Coke. She poured half of the can into an unwashed baby bottle. Without a coyote to prod them along, and with no money, the family temporarily settled in a slum outside of the city of San Cristobal to save funds for the final push north. The girl's father lived in Chicago. She'd never heard of the place and hated the guy. She met an old lady whose sister had died and had an unoccupied shed behind her own. The girls cleaned, pumped water, and did chores as rent. Jocelyn found early morning work unloading produce from battered trucks at a local market. She took her youngest with her, sick with diarrhea. The little girl slept beneath 2 chairs on a blanket by stalks of cabbage her mother would take home. About a week into their stay at the old lady's house, Natalia accidentally broke their only coffee mug. On the floor, a faded and now parted flag of Texas. Karina decided to walk alone to a local tienda seeking a replacement, but having no money. Long links of sealed chip bags hung from the gated shop. Customers ordered from outside, yelling through the metal bars. The local news ran on an unwatched fuzzy TV in the corner, showing the American president speaking on mute, then panning to a shot of the border wall under construction. Karina explained her situation to the store attendant and promised that she'd pay the tienda back for an adhesive glue tube. The shop worker refused, saying it was too much of a risk for him. El negocio está muy mal, he lamented. A fat guy in a red and white soccer jersey stood behind her, smoking a cigarette. He over-eagerly offered to pay for the tube of glue, shoving a bill into her hands. Karina stepped backwards onto a cat's tail which sprung up and bit her calf. When she fell to the floor, the man tried to take Karina over his shoulder, stumbling towards a waiting car, but she slipped out and bolted home, flying over puddles and agitating the local street dogs. Abducted women and children are often found on the side of highways, disgorged and mutilated beyond recognition. The southern borderlands are as rugged as terrain comes in this world. Ravines and canyons create death traps, littered with the bodies of deflated and dried-out animals and humans. Shredded backpacks and lost shoes show where bones can be found. Makeshift crosses are stuck into the crusted earth in memory of the disappeared, those thousands swallowed whole by the sun. Camila and her boys must have thought of El Norte as a vast land of stinging bugs and needle-bearing brush that'll rip your clothes off. The Arizona wind was brisk and unwelcoming as they stepped in a single-file line across the endless landscape. Solo se camina al anochecer, warned the man with the broom who swept away their footprints from the scrambly stone slope, trying to evade detection. Gerardo's older brother Alejandro followed the coyote closely, who scanned the sky for border patrol helicopters and surveillance drones. A pit of darkness grew behind them. Those left behind stayed behind. Cheap cloth sneakers tore open on sharp stones and filled with pebbles and sand. Rattlesnake coils submerged with the vibration of their steps. Mouths and lips cracked and split and turned black. When the sun rose, it came time to hide beneath dried mesquite brush, which offered almost no shield from the sun. Splinters gathered underneath fingernails, ants blistered the children's skin, women prayed to Jesus and an assortment of virgins in their impossible sleep. Gerardo expected his father to be hiding behind a cactus with a gleaming machete, waiting. The more experienced of the bunch warned them to keep their shoes on tightly the entire time, as running for dear life could be needed at any moment. Perder un zapato aquí es una pena de muerte. Karina's family made it to the western edge of Tijuana, a highly patrolled part of the border, without a chance of crossing undetected. They reached a slatted barrier that extended into the sea. Her body could fit between two of the slats by turning sideways, but the gap was too narrow for the rest of the family. Jocelyn pulled her daughter back to the Mexican side and swore death rather than have her family separated. Further down the fence was the Pacific Ocean, where the slats extend about 100 yards into the water. As if her motherly instinct could part an ocean, they stepped in, quickly losing footing. Her smallest daughter had never swam before, and small waves washed over her head. She climbed into Jocelyn's back, coughing salt water from her little nose. Aguante, mi amor, ya casi llegamos. A current swept them to the last of the slatted barriers, where Jocelyn hooked on, hugging up against its metallic edge. Slat by slat, with her kids holding onto her jacket, she dragged against the water and towards the shore. Her arms shook, and her blinking eyes stung with salt. The family of four lay on the wet sand, cold, shivering, and in the U.S. A green-striped Border Patrol SUV pulled up. Two agents stepped out and strolled towards them. Jocelyn cried in fear and relief. She was handcuffed as the agent spoke to her in short Spanish phrases she couldn't hear with her water-clogged ears. Her daughters cried as the four of them sat on the hard bench seat behind a metal mesh that separated them from the driver, who blasted the AC and radio, indifferent to the otherworldly accomplishment he'd just witnessed. Karina wiped her mother's face down with her own wet shirt sleeve. Within an hour, Jocelyn and her girls were taken to an enormous gray warehouse surrounded with extensive fencing topped with razor wire, a private detention center run by the Geo Group. Wearing their same soiled clothing, each of their fingerprints were taken. Jocelyn sat before a stout mustached man with a thin gold chain linked to his glasses. He spoke with heavily accented Spanish, demanding her details, then printed a picture of her onto a long form in English, which she signed without understanding. She explained that she wanted to work and put the girls in school, and that their father lived in Chicago. She told them about the gang hunting them back home. By the end of the interview, her head was in her hands, crying only the tears a mother could cry. She spent 3 days sleeping on the floor so her youngest daughters could share a mat. The fluorescent lights never turned off, and the human stench was so severe that guards could be heard retching beneath their face masks. At all hours she could hear laughter, labored breathing, prayer, and tears. Some of the women screamed at the guards, demanding access to showers and pleading for menstrual pads. On her 4th morning, an impatient Hispanic woman walked into the group holding cell and called her name. Te vas a Chicago, alístate. Her ankle tracer was fastened as she sat self-consciously in a plastic chair. Si te la remueves, te quito la familia. Te pongo en la prisión, said the officer. Together with about a dozen others, they were driven in a windowless, flat-nosed white bus to the local Greyhound bus station and were dropped off on the platform loading buses to Chicago. Upon noticing the situation, a Mexican grandma traveling with her grandson gave Jocelyn a pair of children's sneakers, inadequate for the hard Midwest winter. Que Dios te bendiga, they said to each other repeatedly, hand in hand. A metallic old Greyhound pulled up to the curb, stopping exactly behind a painted yellow stripe, hissing and vibrating noisily. Camila and her boys stepped over the ruined border barrier in a place where the jagged metal had corrugated through. Barriers along this section of the border turned into rusted ruins within a few years, bent by the sun and pocked with bullet holes. They had walked all night, and well past dawn, breaking the cardinal rule about moving during daylight hours, risking capture or death by heat stroke. But water was low, and the need to arrive was pressing on their throats. They took their first steps into the country and walked towards a thin line of dust in the distance. They shuffled towards a brown concrete building with a parked van inside, as the sound of an AC box buzzed like a million flies. For those still walking, the need for water outweighed the fear of capture or return. The outpost turned prison was frigid, and neon white lights spotlighted the bare inside of the building. They called it La Hielera, the icebox. Camila trembled, squinting her eyes as if in a mirage. There were 2 fenced-off sections with a gate between them. Men to the left, women to the right, without exceptions. After an initial interview with an intake officer, Camila was given an extra-large manila envelope for her growing pile of immigration paperwork and hotline information she couldn't read. She was taken to the women's side, and Gerardo and Alejandro were taken to the men's. 3 days of crying and begging ensued. Even the coyote hadn't separated her from her little one, she thought. On his first night, Gerardo developed a fever and was left to lie on a concrete bench, shivering until lunchtime the next day. Camila got word of her son's condition from a man she recognized from the truck in Mexico, who shouted the news through the gate. Alejandro had not wanted to tell her. She begged guards for medicine, with her hands facing upwards as if in Sunday Mass. Gerardo didn't get medical attention or a single change of clothes during those 3 days. Ni un panador le dieron, she said to me. Alejandro was jailed with his brother during those 3 days in detention, but instead of being released to travel to Chicago with his family, he was transferred to the Otero County Immigration Processing Center in New Mexico, where there were dozens of hunger strikes in protest of terrible conditions. He had recently turned 18 and would be deported back to Guatemala alone. Camila and Geraldo were dumped at a Greyhound bus station with a plastic bag containing all of their belongings, their shoes without shoelaces. A Catholic organization waiting for regular groups of immigrants coaxed the two into a van with hot chocolate and donuts and drove them to a homeless relief center run out of the church basement. They gave them 2 bus tickets to Chicago, saran wrap sandwiches, and a small pocket Bible in Spanish. Alejandro was imprisoned for almost a year before being deported back to Guatemala without his family. He called his mom and threatened suicide in his jail cell. Camila was emotionally wounded and would cry on some afternoons when she picked up her son from school. Nunca pensé que me quitaran mi hijo. He clapped her palms against her eyes as if to stop them from falling out. Solo Diosito me impide de suicidarme, she said to me once. Roughly a year later, Alejandro would try for the border again, making it undetected, but he would never see his mother alive again. Upon stepping outside the Greyhound station, where the Eisenhower Expressway unloads traffic into the downtown Chicago loop, the harsh air seemed to suck smoke from Camila's nostrils and mouth. She arched her back and looked up to the great frigid skyscrapers. Iron, steel, and brick immersed in low-hanging clouds. It made her dizzy. Too far from Guatemala, she thought. Eventually, her brother picked them up in a paint-splattered work van with ladders fastened on top that squeaked when he hit potholes. Camila walked into the front office of the school wearing an ankle tracker, with an unsure adolescent son behind her, head bowed, hair gelled in a wave. I assured her that I'd help Geraldo learn English, and that they'd get all the help they needed. An impossible promise. Geraldo's trauma was quiet and internal, not like the outward messy kind I'd seen in other kids. He'd speak only in short, canned responses, and offered plenty of silence, which carried a weight, retaining a pool of memories, like a tired old man. His mind's eye saw the violence, a dead horse dried out in the desert, his father drunk with a machete, a gun fired into the night, the separation from his brother, the fever of fleeing home suddenly. They shared an unfurnished basement unit, sleeping on blankets on the floor. When a few of Geraldo's teachers got word of this, we donated the family mattresses and a couch, untethering the furniture from car roofs before heading to school in the early morning. There were also online fundraising campaigns that helped them pay rent and stay housed. Against school district policy, I drove both moms to the Catholic Charities of Chicago Downtown Relief Center. Beneath granite buildings which echoed from the roaring of train cars flying overhead, we escaped into the homeless shelter, where both moms were given shoes and frozen groceries for a week. An old man wearing multiple layers limped by, his pockets full of plastic bags. This is where Chicago's tired and forgotten sought refuge on the coldest nights, when mornings came with frozen bodies found underneath viaducts on Lakeshore Drive. After months of waiting, Camila and Geraldo were given an appointment with an immigration attorney working from a Vietnamese community center in the uptown neighborhood of the north side of Chicago. I decided to drive them to avoid them missing their appointment. At a rushed intersection, my car sputtered and died. I pushed it to the corner, and both of them stepped out onto the sidewalk. I felt an all-compelling force in that moment to ensure that they arrive at their appointment, regardless of cost or effort. I would not abide by a world where mother and child could go so far to seek peace, only to find an old Elantra in their way. I called her a ride, assuring her that I'd make my way there once my car was towed. I then called the legal clinic to update them, and they told me they didn't have any Spanish speakers available to translate. Refusing to reschedule, I translated the first half of their asylum application via speakerphone in a shared Uber. Once I arrived, I translated Camila's interview to an enthusiastic young lawyer who mulled over the details of the domestic abuse, typing away notes about the regular beatings she withstood for years, the unspeakable things her kids had witnessed. Camila's asylum case was eventually picked up by a pro bono attorney working with the National Immigration Justice Center. But about a year later, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Camila contracted the virus and died suddenly, leaving behind her teenage boy engulfed in a world of uncertainty and loss. Her family's wishes for a dignified burial in Guatemala have been made impossible due to the pandemic, and as of May 2020, the issue of Gerardo's guardianship is yet to be resolved. Jocelyn's family of 5 was already crammed into a small, unfinished apartment when a second family of 3 they knew from Honduras moved in. Jocelyn welcomed help with the rent, and especially from a fellow Honduran mom. The new family arrived late into the school year, a ragged-voiced woman with blotches around her pupils, a fair-skinned and illiterate third-grade girl with a voice like her mom's, and a dumpling of a little boy who'd missed kindergarten. The 6 kids slept in rows of donated mattresses and blankets on the floor, with the 2 smallest ones sharing the couch. Waking hours were hectic. Children cried, toys were thrown, and Karina watched the bunch while parents worked night and weekends. The desperate arrangement of 8 people sharing the apartment became unbearable. On the first day of summer break, Jocelyn's estranged husband and the landlord demanded that they leave, threatening to throw their garbage bags of donated blankets and used toys out into the smog of Chicago summer. I got a call from Karina, who'd taken her mom's phone and whispered to me that they'd had nowhere to go, and that their parents were fighting. Jocelyn screamed into the rising heat about the girl's father dumping them into homelessness, enough to cause him shame as neighbors excoriated him from their porches and open windows. They had until the end of the month, he decided. That was the very last time I spoke directly to that family, although I did learn that Jocelyn was denied pro bono legal representation for her asylum case, likely because she couldn't document the danger they'd faced back home, the way Camila had. They'll most likely be deported back to Honduras, as so many before them. I must entertain both realities, that Natalia, Karina, their baby sister and mom are safe, and eating dinner together under a shared roof, that girls are in school, building their lives to be different. I also hear them crying somewhere dark and filthy, where violence is king and the past repeats itself. I see Gerardo building from his mother's death, a brave young immigrant, completing his schooling and fighting like hell for his people. But too, he may end up back in the deportation machine, sent back to Guatemala without mother or father. That school year made me quit. My second graders had grown tall and soon had to apply to high schools. Some of the kids flourished, others disappeared, and at least one died. And now I'll never fully know how things turn out, and I must leave these threads untied. These hundreds of children in my mind carry on in some place and time. With them they carry the history to which the adult world submitted them, the vile legacy of American moral, spiritual, and societal corruption, the weaponization of children, the singling out of women and girls, the violation of the basic human tenet that children are sacred, and that any civilization that forgets is doomed to its own barbarous failure. From the darkness they came, but with light on their shoulders. The brilliance of those children may fix us, mending where we were corrupted, forging an indisputable clarity, so that we may understand forever that children and families are never illegal, and that every fiber of the shared human future depends on the smallest baby, feverish and alone, in the most crowded border prison camp of our era.
This language pumps the lifeblood of settlers that came to rip out tongues and try to clean us out with soap. And it reminds me of how Mom tried the same, wanting to wash the anger I felt with her own. And when my mouth exploded, and when years of an aching stomach became the truth in the lies that Mom and I were fed, that papaya soap, not brownness, was good for us. Still, we are not qualified to be us. We need paperwork for that. Like all the other words that went missing since we immigrated here, not knowing until now what it means to move. The same year the Twin Towers went down, the same year they buried torture memos with dead bodies, the same year they justified their terrorism by hiding behind stock market spikes and so-called white lies. We are the collateral damage they cannot name. After ripping what is ours out of ourselves, they sold me salvation at the expense of my history, so we wouldn't look back, couldn't look back, to see that walls were built around us from as early as 1521. And now they think we all look the same, mistaking me for my neighbors, who I love, but are not me, because they erased the names they wouldn't pronounce. Hawakan mo ang dila mo.
Toyon Literary Magazine accepts submissions year-round. All artists are invited to submit. For more information, please see our website at www.toyonliterarymagazine.org. We hope you enjoyed listening to the audiobook version of Toyon Multilingual Literary Magazine, Volume 67, Lados. Thank you.